The night exploded into a full-on celebration, laughter ringing out over the clinking of glasses, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't actually proud of what we'd pulled together. 10 years of marriage was no small thing, and I'd planned everything perfectly for this milestone. I spent months setting it up. A live band, catering, decorations, everything Rebecca had ever hinted she'd wanted for our anniversary. And there she was, my wife, in a stunning silver dress I'd bought her, flashing that perfect smile, effortlessly charming our guests. But as the night wore on, I started noticing something strange. Every time she thought no one was watching, her smile faded into this different expression, something colder, almost calculating. It was subtle. If I didn't know her so well, I might have missed it. But this was the same woman I'd spent a decade with. I knew every shift in her mood, every shade of her expressions. And tonight, there was an edge to her I couldn't quite place. The band started playing one of her favorite songs, and I watched as she laughed with her friends, accepted compliments, and occasionally glanced my way. That's when I realized she wasn't just looking at me. She was searching the room. Her eyes flicked around, skipping over familiar faces, landing on one person in particular. My father. I tried to ignore it. Scott. My dad was enjoying the party as much as anyone, maybe even a little more, considering how many drinks he'd had. He was always the life of any party, the kind of guy everyone wanted to be around. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the way Rebecca kept gravitating toward him, like there was some private connection between them I didn't know about. She'd always gotten along well with him, too well maybe now that I thought about it. But here she was, laughing a little too hard at his jokes, standing just a little too close, like they had this inside joke they weren't sharing. And then it happened. They were across the room, just at the edge of the dance floor. I was mid-conversation with my brother when I saw her touch his arm, her fingers lingering there in a way that wasn't just friendly or familial. She leaned in, her hand sliding down his arm in a way that was too deliberate, too intimate. My dad, whether he was too tipsy to notice or just completely clueless, didn't pull away. He even smiled, that smooth, slightly crooked smile he'd always had. And Rebecca, my wife, looked at him with this look I'd never seen before. It was raw, unguarded, as if she'd forgotten anyone else was even watching. My pulse was hammering. It felt like everything froze around me, like my brain was struggling to process what I'd just seen. She looked up, catching my gaze, and for a split second, her expression changed. She knew I'd seen it. But then, without missing a beat, she plastered that fake, polished smile back on her face and raised her champagne glass in my direction as if toasting me. But I knew then, it wasn't me she was toasting. I forced a smile, nodding back in her direction, all the while feeling like I was suffocating. My brother kept talking beside me, completely unaware, his words just a muffled background noise as I tried to piece together what I'd just seen. The whole room felt warped, almost surreal. It was as if every laugh, every clink of glass, every detail of that celebration suddenly grated against me, stinging and mocking in a way I couldn't ignore. Trying to keep my composure, I excused myself and made my way to the restroom, gripping the edge of the sink as soon as I got inside. My head was buzzing, pounding with questions I didn't even want to think about. Was I imagining it? Could I really have seen that right? No, I'd seen exactly what I'd seen. And more disturbingly, I'd seen her expression. The way she dared to raise her glass to me afterward, as if this twisted little moment was some kind of inside joke. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to steady myself. Keep it together, I told myself, keep it together. When I finally returned to the party, Rebecca was nowhere to be found, and my heart dropped. Then, across the room, I spotted my dad laughing with a few friends, clearly enjoying himself. But Rebecca? She'd vanished, like smoke. I scoured the place, forcing myself to smile at people, trying not to look like a madman as I glanced around. But I couldn't find her. Finally, I stepped outside, thinking she might have gone for some fresh air. And there, just around the corner of the building, I heard hushed voices. I took a few steps forward, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. And as I rounded the corner, I saw her, Rebecca, standing a little too close to another man. Not my dad this time. No, this was Jason, one of my closest friends. Her hand was on his shoulder, just like it had been on my father's earlier, and she was smiling up at him, whispering something I couldn't hear but didn't need to. The way she looked at him, the way she laughed softly and touched his arm, it was all too familiar. It was like she was playing the same little game with him that she'd just played with my father. As if the rest of us were chess pieces she was moving around however she liked. I could hardly believe it, but at that moment, any doubts had disappeared. This wasn't my imagination, and it wasn't a one-off thing. She was toying with people, maybe with all of us, and she didn't care if I was watching. I cleared my throat loudly, and they both turned, looking as if I'd caught them mid-crime. Jason stepped back, obviously embarrassed, and muttered something about needing to get back inside. But Rebecca just looked at me, her face completely calm, maybe even amused. She tilted her head, giving me that same polished, picture-perfect smile she'd been wearing all night. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock innocence, like I was the one making a scene. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "Just thought I'd check on you." "Oh, don't worry about me," she said, her tone smooth and sweet, but with this underlying edge that made my skin crawl. "I was just having a little chat with Jason." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "You know how everyone wants a piece of the birthday girl." Birthday girl. My stomach churned at the way she said it, as if she'd just thrown the entire celebration in my face, making me realize how blind I'd been. She walked past me then, lightly brushing my shoulder as if nothing had happened, leaving me there alone in the cold night air. Fists clenched and mind racing, I stood outside for a few minutes, watching her silver dress disappear back into the party, sparkling under the lights like she was some kind of star of her own private show. And I realized that was exactly what she was. My wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone else, was on a stage, performing her way through our marriage, and apparently tonight she'd decided to have an audience. Taking a deep breath, I followed her back inside, determined to confront her. But before I could get close, she was already on the dance floor with Jason, laughing like nothing had happened. Watching her, it hit me how often she'd slipped away these past few months with some excuse or other. Late meetings, unexpected errands, dinners with friends. But tonight, I was seeing the reality in real time, and it felt like pieces of a dark puzzle were finally clicking into place. She spun around, catching my eye as I watched from the edge of the dance floor. Instead of looking startled or guilty, she looked right at me, holding my gaze with this twisted little smirk, like she was daring me to do something about it. And as if to hammer in the point, she leaned into Jason, her lips brushing his ear as she laughed. Jason, for his part, looked more confused than anything, probably wondering why she was suddenly so friendly. The thought crossed my mind. How many people had she been like this with while I'd been too stupid to see it? That smirk was the last straw. I crossed the dance floor, barely aware of the music or the crowd around us. Rebecca saw me coming, and instead of backing off, she stayed right there, one hand still on Jason's shoulder as if to taunt me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low enough that only she could hear. "Oh, honey," she purred, like I was some child interrupting her fun. "Can't it wait? This is a celebration, after all." My patience snapped. "No, it can't wait," I bit out, tightening my grip on her arm just enough to make my point. Her smile faded, her eyes narrowing as she met my gaze. Finally, she turned to Jason, patting him on the shoulder. "Don't go anywhere," she said, like she'd be right back to pick up where she'd left off. We walked to a quiet corner, and I dropped her arm, standing back to face her, feeling the weight of all the questions I'd shoved down for months finally ready to come out. She looked up at me, crossing her arms with this casual boredom, as if she had better things to do than listen to me. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, my voice barely controlled. "First my father, now Jason? What kind of game are you playing?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence with a small, exasperated sigh. "You're imagining things, Derek. This is a party. People flirt. It's harmless." "Flirting?" he echoed, my voice rising. "You were touching my father like he was your date. Then I find you with Jason. Do you even care what you're doing?" She shrugged, a cold, dismissive smile on her face. "It's not my fault you're insecure. Maybe if you didn't follow me around like some jealous watchdog, you wouldn't feel so threatened." Her words hit me like a punch. I come here thinking she'd deny everything, maybe apologize, even give some flimsy excuse. But instead, she was looking at me with pure contempt, like I was the one out of line. It felt like some alternate reality, a version of Rebecca I'd never known, or maybe never wanted to know. "So that's it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're just going to stand here and tell me that humiliating me in front of everyone, including my family, is no big deal?" She laughed. A short, bitter laugh that stung more than anything else she'd said. "God, Derek, do you even hear yourself? You're so predictable, always acting like the perfect husband, throwing me these little celebrations. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I'm bored?" The words twisted in my gut, sharp and cutting. Bored? After everything I'd done for her, she was bored? "So what now?" I asked, my voice tight. "You're just going to flirt with every man in the room to prove some point?" She shrugged again, her tone so icy it made my blood run cold. "I didn't make you invite your father or Jason here. If you're upset about it, maybe you should look in the mirror and ask yourself why." Then she turned, leaving me standing there alone, watching her walk away without a trace of remorse. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a one-off thing, or even a misunderstanding. She knew exactly what she was doing, and worse, she didn't care that I watched her walk away. Her back turned to me as if I didn't even matter. She strolled through the room, smiling, laughing, as though our conversation hadn't just torn apart everything I thought I knew about her. Every fiber in me wanted to leave, but a stronger part, a darker part, told me to stay and see where this led. I couldn't leave without understanding the full truth, no matter how twisted and humiliating it might be. Taking a deep breath, I slipped back into the crowd, keeping my distance but watching her every move. She floated between our friends and family with that perfect, practiced grace. As she mingled, her laughter rang out in these light, playful notes, completely at odds with the venom she'd just thrown at me. It felt like I was watching a stranger, the real her, maybe hiding under a mask all these years. But tonight, she seemed to be shedding that mask bit by bit, letting everyone catch a glimpse of something darker underneath. Then I saw her step over to the far side of the room, where a small group was gathered near the bar, tucked just out of earshot from the main crowd. As I moved closer, I caught the familiar profile of another man. Rick, one of my colleagues and one of Rebecca's old friends from way back. I hadn't thought much about it before, but she'd been surprisingly close to him lately, bringing him up casually in conversation, occasionally mentioning catching up over coffee. I edged closer, just enough to hear snippets of their conversation. They were talking quietly, their voices low, but her body language said everything her words didn't. She leaned in, her hand resting on his arm as she whispered something, laughing softly as her fingers traced little patterns on his sleeve. Rick glanced around nervously, clearly aware of the crowd but also captivated, hanging on her every word. I was close enough now to hear fragments. "So, when are you finally going to tell him?" Rick murmured, glancing sideways, his voice low but tense. My blood ran cold. Rebecca smirked, swirling her glass. "Patience," she whispered, with that same edge in her voice. "He'll figure it out soon enough. Besides, it's kind of fun watching him scramble around trying to be the perfect husband. Honestly, it's like he's trying to set himself up for failure." Rick chuckled nervously, not quite sure if he should be laughing or concerned. But Rebecca leaned closer, her eyes gleaming with something sharp, almost vicious. "Let him keep playing his little game," she said, her voice dropping so low I had to strain to hear her. "The best part of this whole act is that he still thinks he's got control. It's cute, really." I could barely breathe. I felt like I'd been thrown into some nightmare where every word I heard sliced into me deeper. I'd been played, humiliated, and she was enjoying every second of it. And the worst part was, she wasn't just playing me. She was doing it publicly, with my own friends, in front of my family, weaving this twisted little show without a shred of guilt. Rick seemed uncomfortable, shifting on his feet, clearly unsure how to respond. He started to pull away, glancing toward the crowd, but Rebecca grabbed his arm, leaning in close enough that their faces were inches apart. "Oh, come on," she whispered with a sly smile. "You're not getting nervous, are you? Besides, if he can't keep up, that's hardly our problem, is it?" I had heard enough. A chill ran through me as I stepped back from the bar, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. I couldn't stand here like some passive bystander any longer, watching her tear down every shred of respect I had for our marriage. She was treating me like a pawn in her twisted game, and that part of me, the part that still hoped this was a misunderstanding, was dead. I wasn't going to let her walk all over me in front of everyone we knew, playing innocent while tearing me apart behind my back. I didn't care about the scene anymore. I marched straight toward her and Rick, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sound of the music, the laughter, everything around me. Rebecca saw me coming, and for a split second, I caught the surprise in her eyes before she masked it with that same infuriating smile. She tilted her head, a picture of false innocence, her fingers still resting lightly on Rick's arm. "What's going on here, Rebecca?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended, drawing the attention of a few guests nearby. But I didn't care. I wanted everyone to see her for who she really was. Rebecca didn't miss a beat. She smirked, releasing Rick's arm as she faced me with that same calm, dismissive expression. "What's with the scene, Derek? Can't I talk to an old friend without you acting paranoid?" Her tone was pure poison, daring me to accuse her, to say something that would put the blame on me. But I was done playing along. "Paranoid?" I shot back, my voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "I've watched you tonight, watched you throw yourself at my father, at Jason, and now Rick. Don't try to turn this around on me, Rebecca. You're not fooling anyone anymore." Rick shifted uncomfortably, looking like he wished he were anywhere but here. But Rebecca didn't so much as blink. If anything, my anger seemed to amuse her. She glanced around at the guests who'd turned to watch us, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "Oh, look, everyone. Derek's having a meltdown because he can't handle his own insecurities." The words stung, and her tone, condescending, laced with pure disdain, fueled a fury I could hardly contain. But I held my ground, refusing to back down. "This isn't about insecurities, Rebecca. This is about respect. Something you clearly don't have for me or for this marriage." At that, her expression shifted, turning hard and unfiltered. She took a step closer, her voice dropping low enough that only I could hear. "Respect? Don't kid yourself, Derek. You were always too blind to see what was right in front of you. Maybe if you'd paid a little more attention, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." I stared at her, the full weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't just admitting to flirting. She was taunting me with it, reveling in my pain. And suddenly, I realized this wasn't just a betrayal. This was her twisted way of rewriting our whole history, as if every moment we'd shared, every promise we'd made, was just another part of her game. The noise of the room faded into the background, and all I could see was her, this stranger in front of me who wore my wife's face but spoke with pure contempt. For a split second, I wondered if she'd ever truly loved me, or if I'd just been a convenient piece in her little play. I swallowed hard, barely able to get the words out. "You really don't feel a single shred of guilt, do you?" She laughed, a cold, cutting laugh that twisted in my gut. "Guilt?" she scoffed. "Oh, please, Derek, don't be so dramatic. Life is too short to be tied down by someone who can't keep up." The weight of her words crushed the last of my restraint. The smugness in her eyes was unbearable, like she'd been waiting for this moment, to see me unravel, right here, in front of everyone. And in that instant, I knew there was no going back. Whatever illusions I'd held on to, whatever excuses I'd made for her, those were gone. Without another word, I stepped back, putting distance between us. My voice was low, deadly calm, the kind of calm that comes right before everything breaks. "You want to live without ties, Rebecca? Fine. But don't pretend it's my fault you turned into a stranger. Don't pretend you didn't know what you were doing." I turned toward the small crowd that had gathered, my gaze landing on my father, who was watching us with an expression that shifted from confusion to shock as he began to put the pieces together. His face paled as he took in the scene, his eyes flickering from Rebecca to me. Suddenly, everything I'd held back, all the doubts and bitterness, surged forward. "Why don't you tell everyone, Rebecca?" I said, my voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Tell them how you couldn't even get through our anniversary without throwing yourself at my father, or Jason, or Rick." My voice cracked on the last name, my throat tight with anger and hurt. Rebecca's expression faltered, just a flicker of something that might have been surprise or fear. But she recovered quickly, her face hardening as she glanced around, realizing that her act had slipped and that everyone was watching. And for the first time that night, her mask dropped completely, replaced by something darker. A twisted blend of anger and contempt. "You want me to say it, Derek?" she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "Fine, I'll say it. I've been miserable. I'm tired of pretending that you're the perfect husband, that this whole happy life you built is anything but a cage." She looked around at the people watching, her voice rising. "He acts like he's the ideal husband, but he's nothing more than a desperate, needy little man who couldn't see what was happening right in front of him." The words hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just airing out our marriage. She was tearing down every single memory, every shared moment, ripping it apart in front of our friends and family. I felt a wave of nausea, a bitterness so deep I could barely breathe. This was her game, and she was going to burn it all down. "Is that it?" I asked, my voice raw, the room deathly silent now. "This entire time, it was all a lie? You were just waiting for the moment you could finally show everyone how much you despised me?" She shrugged, her eyes flashing with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "Maybe it was. Or maybe you were too wrapped up in your little fantasy to see the truth. Either way, Derek, I'm done pretending." The finality in her words hit me hard. I stood there, feeling every eye on us, the weight of their shock, their pity, bearing down on me. There was nothing left to say. She'd made it clear, right here in front of everyone, that our life, our marriage, everything I'd held sacred, meant nothing to her. I turned away, barely able to see through the red haze of anger and betrayal. As I walked through the crowd, I heard the murmurs, the whispered words, and felt their gazes on me. But I didn't stop, couldn't. The life I thought I knew had just shattered, and there was nothing left but the pieces. I left the room, trying to escape the suffocating mix of pity and disbelief that hung in the air. My mind was reeling, every step feeling heavier than the last as I fought to hold back the wave of humiliation crashing over me. Outside, I found a quiet corner by a garden wall, away from the noise, the faces, and most importantly, her. I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself, the anger simmering low and dangerous inside me. I barely noticed footsteps approaching until a voice broke through the silence. "Derek!" I turned to see my father, his face lined with an expression I'd never seen before. Regret, guilt, something raw that felt out of place on him. He was quiet for a moment, like he didn't quite know where to begin, before he finally spoke. "I had no idea, son. I'm sorry." My instinct was to brush him off, to walk away and keep the pain to myself. But there was something different in his eyes, something that made me pause. He seemed genuinely remorseful, his usual confidence replaced by a vulnerability I wasn't used to seeing. Part of me wanted to unleash my anger on him, to tell him he'd played right into her hands, that he'd let her make a fool out of me in front of everyone. But somehow I kept it in check. "She used you," I said, the bitterness in my voice unmistakable. "She played us all, and you stood there, letting her do it." His face fell and he nodded slowly. "You're right. I didn't see it. I don't know what I thought." He looked down, shaking his head as if he could barely believe it himself. "I thought she was just being friendly, that she was trying to make everyone feel welcome." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I should have known better." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words and regrets. I could see the shame on his face, the realization that he'd been a pawn in her twisted game, and for the first time I felt a twinge of sympathy. This wasn't just my betrayal. It was his too. He reached out, putting a hand on my shoulder, his voice steady but filled with remorse. "Listen, Derek, I can't change what happened. But if there's anything I can do, anything to help you through this." I looked away, the emotions too raw, too overwhelming. I wanted to reject his offer, to tell him that he was as much a part of this mess as she was. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. He'd been blindsided, just like me, swept up in her charm and manipulation. In a way, he'd been a victim too. After a long silence, I nodded. "Just stay away from her," I muttered. "I don't need any more reminders of tonight." He gave a solemn nod, understanding without argument. You have my word. As he walked away, leaving me alone in the garden, I felt the first flicker of clarity in what had become a whirlwind of anger and betrayal. She might have destroyed my trust, humiliated me in front of everyone I knew, but she hadn't won. And with or without her, I would find a way to rebuild the life she tried to tear down. I stayed in the garden for a while, the cool night air grounding me as I tried to process everything. My father's apology echoed in my mind, a reminder that Rebecca's betrayal had extended far beyond me. She'd woven her web around people I loved, twisting friendships and family ties into her game. And as I thought back, I began to notice things that I hadn't seen before, little moments that hadn't made sense until now. For the past few years, Rebecca had skillfully rewritten our history, casting herself as the center of my world while subtly isolating me from everyone else. She'd always had something to say about my friends, my family, little criticisms disguised as casual observations. Don't you think your brother's a bit jealous? Your mom can be a little controlling, don't you think? And each time, she'd convince me that her opinion was somehow a favor, her way of helping me see things clearly. I realized now that she'd been chipping away at my confidence, making me second-guess every relationship except the one with her. It was subtle, never enough to start an argument or raise suspicion, but enough to plant doubts in my mind, doubts that had ultimately pushed me further away from everyone else. And now, seeing the truth laid bare in her cruelty tonight, I understood her game. Control.
Manipulation.
The thrill of bending people to her will, not just in private but in public, where she could wield her power over me as part of her performance. And, God, how I had fallen for it. Every time I doubted her intentions, she'd flipped it on me, accusing me of being insecure, of not trusting her enough. She turned my loyalty into a weapon against me, forcing me to question my own instincts. But tonight, seeing her for who she truly was, I knew that all those doubts I'd ignored had been warnings. Red flags I'd refused to see because I wanted to believe in her. I was so deep in thought that I didn't hear the footsteps approaching until it was too late. I turned and found Jason standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, looking as stunned and uncertain as I felt. "Hey, man," he said quietly, clearly unsure if he was welcome. I just wanted to see if you were okay." Part of me wanted to tell him to go, that I didn't need any more reminders of what had happened tonight. But looking at him, I saw the same bewilderment, the same shock that was running through my own mind, and I realized he, too, had been pulled into her game. Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, Derek, I had no idea I thought we were just catching up, you know? She was talking about old memories and—" He stopped, as if embarrassed, glancing away. "I didn't realize what she was doing until you stepped in." I studied him, sensing his genuine confusion, his shame at being used as another pawn in her twisted game. "It's not your fault," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "She's been working everyone, manipulating all of us." He nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. I should have seen it. I mean, there were moments that felt a little strange, like she was trying to get close to me, but I kept brushing it off. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I guess I just wanted to believe she was being friendly, you know? But after tonight—" He trailed off, shaking his head. I let out a bitter laugh, the irony sinking in. "That's her specialty. She makes you question yourself, makes you feel like any doubt you have is your own problem. And all the while, she's just pulling strings, waiting for the perfect moment to cut them." Jason nodded, his jaw clenched. "I don't know what's wrong with her, man, but whatever it is, you deserve better. She's messed up, and she dragged all of us down with her." We stood there in silence, two friends trying to make sense of the chaos she'd left behind. In that moment, I felt a shift, an understanding that this wasn't just my battle to face alone. She'd hurt everyone around her, weaving us all into her game. And now, with the truth finally in the open, I knew I wasn't going to let her keep this power over me. For the first time that night, I felt a sense of resolve, a flicker of strength I hadn't expected. Jason stayed by my side, a steady presence as I began to gather my thoughts, a sense of clarity forming through the haze of betrayal and anger. I couldn't let her walk away from this, leaving behind a mess she'd created without facing the consequences. She'd humiliated me, torn down relationships, played with my family and friends, all to satisfy whatever twisted need for control she had. And I was done being her pawn. As I walked back inside, Jason followed, his expression hardening as he realized my intentions. He didn't ask questions, just nodded as if to say, "I've got your back." The party had thinned out by now, the guests who remained glancing nervously around, unsure if they should leave or stay. My father stood by the bar, looking shaken, deep in conversation with a few relatives, their faces grim as he tried to explain what little he knew. And then there she was. Rebecca stood near the entrance, a glass of champagne in hand, chatting lightly with a couple of friends who seemed equally out of place. She looked calm, composed, as if the whole ugly scene from earlier had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The sheer audacity of her calmness made my blood boil, and I could feel every muscle tensing as I approached her. She saw me coming, her smile fading ever so slightly before she forced it back, that familiar mask slipping back into place. "Derek," she said with a faux sweetness that was more insulting than anything she could have said outright. "Have you come to make another scene?" I stopped a foot away, not caring about the curious stares around us. Jason stood just behind me, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but firm. "Rebecca," I began, my voice quiet but steely, "it's time you answer for all of this, for what you've done. Not just to me, but to everyone here." She gave a dismissive laugh, rolling her eyes. "Oh, come on. Are we really doing this? You're overreacting. I haven't done anything, Derek. I simply—" She paused, looking around as if searching for the right word. "Socialized. If you can't handle that, maybe it's your own insecurity talking." But I didn't back down. I wasn't letting her deflect this time. Socialized? Is that what you call turning my friends against me? Flirting with my father in front of everyone? Manipulating Jason, Rick, everyone here? Don't try to spin this, Rebecca. You've been pulling strings for a long time. Well, tonight, everyone sees them. A ripple of murmurs spread through the small crowd gathering around us, faces glancing at each other, some in shock, others in understanding. The realization dawned. People were piecing it together, seeing her for what she truly was. And in that moment, her cool exterior began to crack. Her eyes narrowed, her voice lowering as she stepped closer. "You think you're so clever, Derek?" she hissed. "You think calling me out like this is going to change anything? Let me remind you, you were the one who let it happen. You were so busy trying to be the perfect little husband that you never even saw it coming. That's on you." Her words stung, but I didn't flinch. I could feel the anger building, raw and sharp, but I forced myself to keep calm. "You're right. I let it happen because I trusted you, because I thought the woman I married would never do something like this." I looked around, meeting the eyes of my family and friends, people who had believed in our marriage just as much as I had. "But I see you now, Rebecca, and I'm done being part of your game." For the first time, a flash of something like panic crossed her face. She looked around, realizing the crowd was no longer on her side, that her control over the narrative was slipping. She tried to laugh it off, a brittle, empty sound, but nobody joined in. "Fine," she snapped, her mask finally shattering. "Believe whatever you want, but don't pretend you're some kind of victim here, Derek. You wanted this life as much as I did. I just got tired of pretending it was enough." The words hung in the air, but they didn't carry the weight she intended. Instead, they rang hollow, exposing the ugliness beneath her charm. She looked around, waiting for someone to come to her defense, but all she found were blank stares and uncomfortable silence. She was alone in her own twisted web, and for the first time it seemed she understood that. I took a deep breath, feeling an unexpected sense of peace wash over me. I had done what I needed to do. She had lost her power over me, over us all, and now everyone could see her for who she truly was. "Goodbye, Rebecca," I said, my voice steady, final. Without another word, I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of her lies lifting from my shoulders, one step at a time. Leaving Rebecca standing there, exposed and alone, should have felt like the end of some twisted nightmare, but as I walked away, a strange hollowness filled me. The weight of what had happened, the lies, the betrayal, and the public unraveling, still pressed down on me, but now it was different. The shock had faded, leaving only a dull ache, a wound that was fresh but clean, no longer hidden beneath layers of denial. Jason caught up with me as I reached the door, his expression filled with a mix of relief and sympathy. "You all right, man?" he asked, a hand resting on my shoulder. I nodded, though the word felt hollow. "I don't know. I guess I will be." We left the venue together, stepping into the cool night air, and for the first time since everything had started, I felt like I could finally breathe. The street was quiet, and I stood there for a moment, just letting the silence wash over me, grounding myself in something that wasn't filled with deception. Jason waited patiently, as if he sensed I needed that moment, that stillness, to start putting the pieces back together. After a while, I turned to him, feeling the need to clear the air. "Listen, Jason, I'm sorry. If I put you in the middle of this. I didn't mean for you to get dragged into her mess." He shook his head, a firm look in his eyes. "You don't owe me an apology, Derek. None of this is on you. Honestly, I feel like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. She was clever, too clever. But you didn't deserve any of it." Hearing the reassurance helped, but the ache remained. We started walking, our footsteps echoing in the empty street as I let the reality settle in. I had a marriage that was over, a life I'd built around someone who'd treated me like nothing more than a prop. But somehow, walking alongside Jason, I felt less alone, more grounded in the possibility of a life beyond this betrayal. As we neared my car, Jason turned to me, a thoughtful look on his face. I think people like Rebecca, they thrive on making others feel small, like they're in the wrong. They manipulate, tear you down, make you question everything. But you didn't give her that satisfaction tonight. You showed her that she can't keep you in her web." I hadn't thought of it that way, but as he spoke, I realized he was right. I'd confronted her in a way I never thought I could, pulled back the mask she wore, and left her to face her own lies. In doing so, I'd taken back a part of myself that I'd lost somewhere along the way, my dignity, my self-respect. And maybe, even though it hurt now, I'd find strength in that. "Thanks, Jason," I said quietly, realizing how much I'd needed to hear those words. "For everything. For sticking by me tonight. And just for being here." He gave me a nod, his face softening with a look of understanding. "Anytime, man. You're not alone in this. None of us are. Just remember that." I drove home that night feeling a strange blend of emptiness and clarity. I had lost so much in a single evening, but I'd also gained something intangible. A sense of freedom from the lies that had held me down. The drive home felt surreal, a quiet ride through familiar streets that now seemed foreign in the wake of everything I'd learned. I thought back to those first years with Rebecca, back when I still believed in every promise we'd made to each other. But now, as I replayed memories through the lens of her betrayal, I could see how she'd spun those moments into a lie, twisting our history until I barely recognized it. When I finally got home, the silence of the house hit me harder than I expected. Every corner, every photo on the walls, was a reminder of a life that had just imploded. The living room felt staged now, a space we'd filled with furniture she'd picked out, artwork she'd chosen, decor she'd curated to match her vision of a perfect home. But now, I saw it for what it was. A set for a show she'd performed for herself, a stage on which I'd played my role without ever seeing the real script. I sat down heavily on the couch, running my hands over my face, feeling the exhaustion settling deep into my bones. Part of me wanted to pack up everything she'd ever touched, throw it out, burn it if I had to. But another part of me knew that wouldn't erase what had happened. I'd have to confront the loss piece by piece, memory by memory, until the anger and pain gave way to something else. As I looked around, my phone buzzed on the table, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from my mom. "Heard about what happened. We're here if you need us. Love you." The simplicity of it, the quiet understanding, was exactly what I needed. I hadn't yet had the strength to call my parents or explain the situation in any detail, but it seemed that word had spread faster than I'd anticipated. I couldn't hide from this. It was out in the open, and maybe that was a blessing in disguise. For so long, I'd kept my doubts to myself, burying them deep for fear of facing the truth. But now that everyone knew, I didn't have to pretend anymore. I typed out a quick reply, "Thanks, Mom. I might come by tomorrow if that's okay." After I hit send, I leaned back, feeling a strange relief wash over me. In the midst of all the destruction, I was beginning to see a path forward. A life separate from Rebecca, a life that might not be easy to rebuild, but one where I didn't have to constantly doubt myself, where I could trust again, even if that trust had been broken tonight. Just then, another message popped up, this time from Jason. Let me know if you want to grab a drink sometime. You're not going through this alone. For the first time in hours, I felt a small smile tug at the corner of my mouth. I typed back a simple, "Thanks, man. I will." As the night grew quiet, I felt the enormity of what I'd lost. But I also felt the flicker of something I hadn't expected. Hope. I was surrounded by people who cared about me, people who'd seen me at my lowest and hadn't walked away. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start rebuilding from the ashes. The next morning, sunlight seeped through the blinds, casting a warmth across the room that felt oddly comforting. For the first time in ages, I woke up without feeling like I was carrying a weight on my chest. Yes, there was still the pain, sharp and fresh from the night before, but beneath it, there was also relief, the unmistakable sense of freedom from Rebecca's hold over my life. I spent the morning sorting through our home, not out of anger but out of the need to reclaim the space for myself. The items she'd picked, the little touches she'd added, all seemed hollow now. They weren't reminders of a shared life. They were set pieces she'd chosen, props in a performance she'd orchestrated. I gathered a few things into boxes, things she'd bought, photos of the two of us, keepsakes from trips we'd taken. I wasn't sure what I'd do with them yet, but putting them out of sight felt like the first step in reclaiming my home. Around noon, my mom called to check in. Her voice was warm, steady, and filled with the reassurance that only a parent can offer. "Why don't you come by for dinner tonight?" she suggested gently. "You don't have to go through this alone, Derek. We're all here for you." I agreed, and when evening came, I drove to my parents' house, feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and relief. When I arrived, my dad greeted me at the door, his face etched with quiet understanding. He pulled me into a hug, no words needed, and for a moment, the comfort of home washed over me, reminding me of all the things that Rebecca couldn't take away. Inside, my mom had made a spread of my favorite dishes, and the simple act of sitting down to a family meal, surrounded by people who truly cared, felt like a balm over the wounds of the previous night. They didn't push me to talk, didn't ask for details. They let me share what I wanted, offering support without judgment, letting me process at my own pace. As we sat around the table, my mom looked at me, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "Derek, sometimes people come into our lives to teach us something, even if the lesson is a hard one. It's okay to feel hurt and it's okay to feel angry, but don't let that define you. You have so much life ahead of you, and you deserve happiness." Her words struck something deep inside me. For months, I'd been chasing a version of happiness that I thought I needed to find with Rebecca, believing that without her, I'd be lost. But in reality, I'd been losing myself to keep her happy, bending to fit her needs, ignoring my own instincts just to keep the peace. Now, as I sat there, surrounded by people who loved me unconditionally, I realized that maybe happiness didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Maybe it was something I'd find within myself on my own terms. By the time I left that night, I felt lighter, more grounded. I knew there would still be hard days ahead, but I was no longer alone in facing them. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was merely surviving. I felt like I was beginning to reclaim my life. As I drove home, a sense of calm settled over me, and I knew this was the start of something new. Rebecca might have shattered the illusion of our marriage, but she hadn't shattered me. I was still here, still standing, and finally ready to move forward. Over the next few days, I settled into an unexpected peace, a quiet clarity that came from knowing the truth and being free from the weight of pretending. My home, stripped of all the reminders of Rebecca, felt more like my own, and each day I took small steps toward building something that belonged only to me. I made calls to a lawyer, began sorting through our finances, and set the wheels in motion for the divorce. Just a month ago, the thought of separation would have felt like the end of the world, but now, it was the beginning of one I hadn't realized I needed. One evening, as I was scrolling through my phone, I came across an old message thread with a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. His name was Adam, a guy I'd known from college. We'd been close back then, but life had taken us in different directions, and our conversations had eventually faded into silence. I told myself I'd been too busy with work, with keeping Rebecca happy, with making sure everything in our lives ran smoothly. But now, staring at his contact, I realized that I'd let so much of myself fall away just to keep up with the version of life Rebecca had dictated. On a whim, I shot him a message. "Hey Adam, it's been a while. Hope you're well. Just wondering if you're up for catching up sometime." He replied almost immediately, "Derek, wow, it's been ages. I'd love to. Let's grab a drink." My treat. 2 nights later, I met Adam at a local bar, one I hadn't been to in years. Seeing his familiar face, hearing his easy laugh, it felt like coming back to something real, a part of me that I'd neglected in the shadow of my marriage. We spent hours talking, reminiscing, and eventually, as the night wore on, I found myself sharing everything that had happened with Rebecca. The hurt, the betrayal, the relief at finally knowing the truth. Adam listened without interrupting, nodding with a mix of sympathy and understanding. When I was done, he leaned back, taking a thoughtful sip of his drink. "Man, I'm sorry you went through that," he said, his tone serious. "But I think she might have done you a favor. People like that, they're toxic. They drain everything good around them and leave people doubting themselves." He glanced at me, a hint of a smile breaking through. "But you're still here. And maybe now you have the chance to be who you were meant to be all along." His words struck something deep. For so long, I'd let myself be defined by someone else's expectations, someone else's standards. But now that chapter was closing, and for the first time I could write the next one on my own terms. I didn't have to ask permission, didn't have to seek approval. I could be whoever I wanted to be. As the night wound down, Adam clapped me on the shoulder, a grin on his face. "Tell you what, Derek, let's plan a trip. Somewhere new. Doesn't have to be fancy. Just a change of scenery to kick off this new chapter." I hadn't considered a trip, but the idea immediately excited me. A chance to get away, to see something new, to start fresh. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. "All right," I agreed, feeling the first spark of genuine excitement I'd felt in weeks. "Let's do it. I could use an adventure." And with that, a plan was set. A new beginning, a step forward. A chance to reclaim not only my life, but myself. The weeks flew by, and with each passing day, the life I'd known faded further into the background, replaced by something fresh and real. A life that was truly my own. Adam and I planned our trip, a simple getaway to a quiet mountain cabin, far from the drama of the past months. As I packed, I felt a lightness, a thrill of anticipation that had been missing from my life for too long. The night before we left, I sat on the couch in my nearly bare living room, looking around at the stripped-down version of what had once been a shared space. I felt a pang of sadness but also a deep sense of accomplishment. I'd survived Rebecca's betrayal, weathered the worst of the storm, and was now ready to move forward without looking back. I realized that I didn't need the remnants of a life built on deception to remember who I was. In fact, I was finally starting to see myself more clearly. The next morning, Adam picked me up, his car loaded with gear, and we hit the road. The miles rolled by, carrying us further from the city, and I felt the weight of my past falling away, mile by mile. Adam filled the car with music and conversation, his excitement infectious, and I found myself laughing more freely, letting the joy and freedom of the open road wash over me. When we arrived at the cabin, it was everything I hadn't known I needed. Tranquil, surrounded by towering trees, with a view that stretched out to endless mountains. We spent the days hiking, talking, and sitting by the fire, sharing stories from the past and dreams for the future. I realized that my future was entirely unwritten, a blank slate ready for new adventures, friendships, and goals that weren't defined by anyone else. One night, as we sat by the fire under a sky glittering with stars, Adam looked over at me. "You seem different, Derek," he said. "Like you're finally letting yourself breathe." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "I am," I said, my voice steady. "For the first time in a long time, I feel free. I'm not living for anyone else's expectations, just my own." The trip marked the beginning of a new chapter. I returned home feeling stronger, more confident, and ready to embrace life on my terms. The anger and betrayal had been painful, but they had forced me to strip away illusions, to confront the truth about myself and what I wanted. And as I walked into my home, I realized I was stepping into a new life, one where I was the author of my own story. Rebecca's betrayal had taught me something invaluable, that I could survive the worst, rebuild, and find happiness on the other side. I was ready to live again, to trust again, and to build a future that was mine alone.